So I guess let's just go ahead and get started. First of all, who am I? That's not me. So if you search for my name, you get Alan Iverson, and I've had people ask me if I was related. So that's not me. Instead, that's my favorite picture for an avatar. I used to work at Apple back when that was their logo. And then I worked at Symantec for a while on a product called Visual Cafe. Then I did consulting work for clients, including people like BEA and Sun, which is now all Oracle, of course. And that was all under the moniker of Cascade Technology Group, which down in the Bay Area was a really interesting, innovative name. And up here, of course, everything, including the car dealers or oil pumps, are all named Cascade. Came back up here and worked for SolutionsIQ for about 4 years. I was the application development practice manager there, director. And in addition to that, I've written several books. So those are some of my books, and I've also written a couple of articles on things like Maven and Site Mesh. Some of you guys may remember I gave a presentation for SeaJUG 9 months ago, a year ago, or something like that on Maven. So that's sort of my history. But then, of course, what am I up to nowadays? Well, for starters, I'm a dad. This is my son, Liam. And I thought that was a kind of a cool picture. That's him, less than a day old, kind of thinking and pondering the world. So he's about 11 weeks old right now, so that's obviously taking up a good chunk of my time. And then I'm also working on a patent case as a technical expert. And then I'm also spending my time also doing consulting for helping people on basically the topic I'm calling software developer productivity. And what that is it's sort of a mix of architecture and process work. A lot of organizations, they don't get software out very quickly, and maybe they're not as happy with the quality. So I help people do that, working on projects related to that, including with a company called DynacronIS. So I'm actually helping work with them right now on a project. So that's me in a nutshell. So which brings us to our topic today. So I had a period of time about 6 months ago. I was drawing the work I was doing on a 2-year porting project with All-Star Directories was drawing to a close. And so I was looking at what I was going to be doing next. And one of the things about that was I had some ideas for what I wanted to do. And so I decided to go ahead and take a look at what was kind of going on in the state of affairs with web frameworks. I don't know if you guys remember, there was a SeaJUG presentation a few months ago on web frameworks, and we talked about Spring MVC and Grails and all that good stuff. And so during that presentation, I actually put up this slide. And I guess one of the first things that kind of jumps out at you is why? Why are there so many of these web frameworks? So I don't want to spend the whole time just me talking. Anybody got any theories? Why are there so many of these up here? Dave?
Because developers love writing their own framework.
Because developers love writing their own frameworks. So here's a question for you. If I said I was going to pick out an object relational mapping framework, what would I pick? Hibernate? Or ... right? Like it's pretty much that's what you're going to use, right? If you said I need an ORM, and I've got data to back that up, but basically it's kind of one and done. This does not look like a one and done kind of environment. So what makes web frameworks different from other frameworks? Yeah.
I'd say there's different kinds of apps that could be shoehorned into the browsers. Some look like applications in browsers. Some look like web pages with functionality, and that runs the range. And some have more behind them than others. So the front looks bigger, thicker, fancier, and the back is more complicated or not. So given those variables and probably 5 others we can name, that gives us at least 50 combinations, right?
So fundamentally, the kind of app I might build with Spring MVC is probably going to be pretty different from the app I'm building with Flex in terms of what I deliver. That's one of the drivers.
I don't know if those two
Rich internet applications. Yeah. Ajax. Some of this is a difference between component-driven things, kind of like JSF and GWT, and something that's more of a page model, like Wicked typically, right? So those are some of the things that are driving it, right? Okay. Anything else? What else makes these web frameworks?
It's really hard to get a doctor's project without inventing a new technology.
It's really hard to get a what project?
A doctorate project at universities.
A doctor's project without
They're always rolling out new technologies at the universities, and then if it's good enough, they get a funding and off they go.
Right. So some of these are R&D projects. They're spun off from
I can
academic.
actually point at five that I know for sure.
Okay. Interesting. That's more than I would have guessed because I'm used to a lot of these being associated with big companies. You know.
Yeah, the big companies buy up the project when it gets to a certain level of heat in the university system.
Okay. All right.
I think it is.
It's a deceptively simple seeming problem to solve.
Right.
And once you get into the details, it turns out there's a lot under the surface.
Right.
And so people start writing these and then find out that they've got another 30,000 lines.
I think you have to
of code.
speak louder to get it.
So it's deceptive. It's
It's a seemingly simple problem that's essentially bottomless.
right. It seems easy to solve, right? I mean, after all, web browsers, how bad can they be? How hard can they be? Right.
Yeah.
So, which is interesting because some of the stuff some of these are if it's Flash based, then it's basically you've given up on the browsers or container and you've sort of said, I'm just screwed. I'm just using this plugin. Right.
Container.
So one of the and this was one of the things that we talked about in the web frameworks talk, the presentation was one of the big differences here is the nature of the experience that you're trying to deliver. So if I'm talking about a rich internet application that kind of looks and feels like a desktop app, then that's going to drive me to one set of these frameworks. If I'm doing something that's page-based, or more specifically, something that worries about or cares about what a search engine is reading, then I'm going to go in a very different direction with my framework, right? Okay, so
But I was just going to say, if you're also going with the page-based space, you're talking about different kinds of scalability you want.
different kinds of
Do
scalability.
you want to scale to 1,000 with no client-side state, or do you need to scale to millions?
Right. So am I scaling to thousands? Because some of these frameworks, like I think JSF is pretty bad about that. If it's out of the box, it tends to put a lot of state both in the client browser and on the server, right? Because it's got all those trees. You're chuckling like you've been through some fun with JSF. Okay. Some of these others are very minimal, right? Which is actually a really interesting point because that's actually one of the things that first got me intrigued by Play. When we were with ASD, we were building out our apps, and we were using Spring MVC for the front end. And one of the developers pretty early on said, we don't do very much. I think we can make this whole thing totally stateless. And it turned out that wound up having huge benefits in areas that we weren't even expecting. So one of them is scaling, right? We could add more servers and things, but also made deployment much easier. It made debugging much easier. It made a whole bunch of things a lot easier. So I was very interested because Play, in some of its material, that was one of the first things that they talked about was how it was stateless. Okay, so all these issues are kind of floating around in my head. Now, when I was looking at these frameworks, I did want to go for something that was more of an SEO friendly kind of a thing. So that immediately threw out like all of the Flash-based frameworks, a lot of the sort of heavy, super AJAX type things like GWT, which I just thought was kind of interesting that GWT comes from Google, and yet any app you build with GWT, Google's not going to be able to read. But they have their master plan here.
Yeah, not read yet.
What's that?
Not read yet.
Not read yet. Yeah, exactly. So I was very intrigued by Play, and so I decided to take a look at it a little bit more closely. Now, just so you guys know, I didn't. Matt Rabel, this is actually where this diagram came from. Okay, so Play. So I started looking at Play more closely. Another web framework, really? Seriously? Okay, so what were some of the things that I liked? Well, first thing, when I started looking through the materials, there's an integrated stack. And one of the things that's kind of interesting to me is every time I sit down to do a Java project nowadays, they ask me, well, what's the architecture, what's the stack? And what they usually mean is, what web framework are you picking? What middle tier sort of dependency injection thing are you using, which of course they usually mean Spring. And then what am I using to talk to the back end? And so then you have to glue all that stuff together. So every time you start a project, the first thing you have to do is spend your time stitching all that together and using something like Maven or Ant 90 or whatever it is to put your build scripts together. You have to glue all this junk together before you can get anything done. Okay, so Play had all that stuff all put together, which is interesting because it's not just the web framework at that point. You've got the persistence model, and then you've got this the MVC side. It also had all of these pieces built into it. It had the memcache support. It had support for things like GWT, Ivy, Maven, Scala actually support as well. So I'm only going to be talking about the Java stuff, but we had a bunch of people who were talking about Scala. It's stateless, which I thought was very, very compelling as well from a scalability standpoint. And one of the things that I also thought was interesting, and it's sort of related to that, is it's also got a fantastic routing mechanism. So if you ever worked on a project that involved SEO, one of the things that you care about is your URLs, right? So what Play does is they actually have built in this whole URL management model right built into the stack. And what's kind of cool is that when you go in through the UI, you're building out pages. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But you actually make references in the pages to things by the actions that you're taking, not to the links to the paths. So if you rearrange your URL structure, it actually dynamically does that. I'll show you what I'm talking about later. Out-of-the-box cloud support. So of course, especially for projects where I'm just getting started, or if it's my own personal project, not just professional projects, being able to push something to the cloud is very cool. So now, when I say that, of course, what the heck is the cloud? So I know what I think of when I say cloud. How about you guys? If I say I can push an app to the cloud, what do you think
I'd say
that means?
which cloud?
Huh?
Which cloud?
Right, which cloud, right? So what are the short list?
EC2.
What's that?
EC2, Google Apps.
Google App Engine. And of course, the third one, of course, is Azure, right? But of course, I'm not talking about that. So if you want to push to Azure, well, that's probably not going to happen. But so specifically, EC2 means that I can push a WAR out, and I can talk to probably a relational database, either using Amazon's own RDB service, or I'm talking to a MySQL instance or something like that I'm spooling out myself, probably. Or I'm pushing it out to the Google App Engine framework. Or, and there's a couple of other providers out there too. There's Stacks, which provides kind of a management set up on top of EC2. Or actually, the Play guys actually have their own hosting package that they've set up as well. So the cool thing about Play is that I can write my app and I can push it out to any of those environments.
What about if your company has its own cloud environment? How easy is it to adapt to some other cloud?
What the question is,
If
what
a
if your
company has its own, my company has their own cloud environment, so how easy is it to push out there?
well, so
Adapt.
Play does package up everything as just a regular WAR file. So, and because it's stateless, you don't have to worry about managing, shutting down things quite as carefully in terms of pushing stuff out. Depends on how radical the change is when you push. So, but if you did, beyond that, I don't know.
Was there security models and stuff like that for the cloud and the tenant management?
Yeah, so each one of the providers that you push out to has its own
Right.
security encryption setup, right? And that's actually not part of Play itself.
Oh,
Play,
okay.
Play just plays with whatever, right? With the Google App Engine stuff, or your EC2, or your Stacks, or whatever. Integrated testing and TDD support.
Back to this out-of-box cloud support, does that mean it's just got some cute Maven steps, or is it making assumptions right in the app such that it never steps on something that won't work in a highly virtual environment of the cloud?
What does that marketing bullet point mean, Dave?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Okay, so I know it's already written how to get it out to Google App Engine. Well, yeah, but still, isn't there? I don't know. What does it have to not do in order to be a friendly cloud app?
Yeah. So some of that depends on whether or not which you're targeting. So the main two environments that people are targeting are Google App Engine, or they're targeting Stacks or something like that. And the big difference between those is the persistence backend. So if you're using Google, so the Google App Engine has its own persistence model, and Play comes with this persistence framework that makes it very straightforward and easy to work with. And it bootstraps all of the Google App Engine stuff behind the scenes for you. And it also actually gives you stubbed out implementations of a lot of the Google stuff, the Google framework for you. So that way you can build locally. You're working with the Google environment. You're working with their persistent stuff.
Okay,
And then
so
it actually
support for faking it on your local box, support for pushing it, and the right API so when it gets there, it just thinks it hasn't left.
Yeah, and it's got a couple of them. They're a little slick, a little even slicker to me. Like some of the authentication stuff it stubs out as well, which I think is beyond what the Google's SDK does. So you can get your user management you can play around with a little bit, and it's got the same API set for caching and things. So you're just writing to play, and then it's using the Google cache implementation under the covers for you. So because Google has so much of its own stuff, there's actually a module that you install, and it does all that extra stuff for you. And I've got a demo of that for you. Everybody else pretty much uses WARs and JDBC connections for its persistence. And so if you use like the Stacks integration, it's already set up for you, and it adds in some more commands for you. Just not as much stuff as the Google App Engine support, just because Google's got such a wacky, different environment in a lot of ways. So it does a lot more for that. So the bulk of your app you can move over pretty easily because the persistence is so different. That's the biggest thing that you're going to have to. That's the one decision that you have to make pretty early on.
So if it's truly stateless, then does that mean that the user has to be authenticated on every single request?
No, what it does is it has in a cookie-based user authentication system, but that's the only piece that winds up getting pushed out to the browser by the system. So the big bug of it is on the servlet spec, right? You have this session object that you're stuffing, and then it's coordinating the cookie for the user back with all this big chunk of data that you're typically throwing into the session on the server, right? So Play doesn't support that model. It says, okay, if you want to authenticate somebody, then it signs the cookie hash that it sends back for the user authentication for you. So it keeps the notion of a user ID floating around. But other than that, it's not.
That means you have to look the user up every single time.
What's that?
You have to look the user up every single time.
Yeah. And that's where the memcache stuff is interesting too, because then you want to throw stuff into the cache, right? Because it's the session dynamics in the servlet spec versus using some other cache mechanism, right?
Maybe the stateless just means that you can go from, you don't have to go back to the guy you came from. You can go to some other server, clustered of servers. But maybe for the authentication, maybe you still, like he said, maybe you need some sort of state. But
Right.
maybe for most of the transactions, it's stateless.
Yeah, so if I have a couple of boxes sitting here running, I have a user. Okay, these are my 3 app servers running with 3 apps, right? Pretty standard. So typically, what people are talking about when they're talking about stateless versus stateful is the user comes in, they hit, and then some data comes back from the server, and then it gets loaded into the servlet session, right? So then there's maybe some data that's sitting in here, right? So the specific problem, and this is where you get into some really wacky nomenclature, is this user's hitting this app server. Okay, well let's say this app server is going to go away for some reason. It crashed, it died, it burst into flames, whatever. So then what happens to this user in their session, right? So that's the problem, and so what people come up with is when people talk about clustering their app servers, they're often talking about having these 3 app servers then coordinating this data. Okay, so that's where the bug of it comes out, because what is this data and how is it getting moved over? So usually what this is it's serialized data, right? So that means that my application code has to be able to serialize the objects that are getting stored here, and they have to be reinflated on the other servers, right? So that's how I'm doing my server synchronization with a traditional clustered job application server. Well, what happens if this one has version 1.3.2 and this is 1.3.3 because I'm doing an upgrade? Okay, well, the format of that object got changed. So now, what am I synchronizing over here, and how is that working? So I'm sure you guys have all read the serialization stuff thoroughly, and you all properly add in data or update your versions on your serialized objects religiously. You're also adding methods that handle the conversion and format, right? Everybody does that? Okay. So nobody does that. It's
Version
a
2,
stupid
yeah.
waste of time, right? So what now of course the final point is that this is actually always my last coordinator. So what Play does, and this is kind of jumping into a nuance on this one, but hey, it's fun. This is actually kind of a broader topic. What Play does is it says, okay, well, maybe you have a mem cache here, right? So the app, the user comes in, they come in, and they still have the same, I have a user cookie on here, right? And then the app is going to do whatever it's going to do, and if it wants to fetch data and drop stuff into the cache, it can. But if the user hits another server over here, there's no notion that these caches are going to be coordinated or synchronized between each other. Now, Play does allow you to drop in real memcache, not just their own cache. So if you want to use real memcache and send that up for clustering, you could do that.
Does that mean that
So
cache?
you just assume it doesn't take a lot of time to load in a bunch of your data layer and just keep going back to your data layer and asking for it, and then tune your cache appropriately.
Right, so you could be using memcache, right? You could, it's got JPA and it's got support for the Hibernate caching as well. So if you want to use EH cache or one of those kinds of caching providers, you can drop one of those up too. You guys, you saw the presentation last time, right? Super simple stuff, right? So, like, caching is a whole extra thing. The whole point about Play Framework is that you're not going to get a caching problem or issues about these clustering or building your app in a bad way out of the box. It's not encouraging you to start. So one of the classic problems with an app server, and this is from a few years ago, but it was like you'd come in and you'd see this app that people have built, and what they've done is they basically had loaded their entire database into the user session, right? So Play's not having to do that as much. Okay, so I'm going to go back onto the topic here for this. So integrated testing and TDD support. So everybody uses JUnit, right? Okay, no big deal. Okay, now once I'm testing my controllers, okay, well that can be a little bit trickier, and there's some stuff with Spring that does some of that, and Spring MVC, but people don't do too much. How about Selenium? You guys ever tried setting up your own Selenium instance in the continuous integration environment? So it's kind of a pain to get all that up and running. And you have to fiddle with getting the ports right and the server right and all that stuff, right? So with Play, that's just built right in. So you can get web testing, you can get your controller functional testing and your full stack. Right?
Well, when you say it's built in, is it building in hooks to Selenium, or is it figured out the configuration?
It bundles Selenium in it, the Selenium runner, and I will show you the demo in a few minutes.
So I got a question about the integrated stack approach.
Yeah.
When you have a situation now with versions, what if you want to move at a faster pace than Play is, as far as using a version of whatever it's bundling in?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and that's true with all the others, right? Like with Grails, for example. So long story short, you know, at a previous, very recent employer's project, we had a version of Hibernate that came bundled with the JBoss instance, and it was like 3.2.5 security patch 6 or something like that from the IT guys. Well, we were building our app with Grails, and Grails had its version, and then we also had what was certified with Spring in its version, right? So, you know, it's like, there's no magic answer for that framework. And absolutely, every time when you're talking about a merged framework like this, you know, you're going to have to sort out versioning and all that.
But on a positive side, though, you know that those versions of all these different things will work together.
Exactly. I think it's kind of the difference between, like, do I just want to drive my car, or do I want to, like, swap out, you know, a component, right? Like if I'm going to change out my carburetor because I want to rev it. You know, they're just different approaches. Last point, and this is actually kind of one of the coolest things that really caught my attention. So on some level, writing like JSPs is more fun than writing regular Java code, because you can tap back and forth to your browser and see what's going on immediately. Grails and Groovy, same thing, right? You can like tab back and forth between and see what's going on. So with Play, what's interesting is they threw out the stateful stuff, so they're not worrying about keeping all these stale objects around. And then what they did is they added in the instant edit and reload everywhere to all of the Java code. So you're creating your model in JPA, and you tab back, and then you tab back again, and it's recycling the whole entity framework on you. Your controllers, you're able to edit your controller just as easily as you are your UI page. So if you're familiar to a model where, okay, well, I'm working in the JSP and it's really fast and I can see what I'm doing. Oh wait, I want to add one thing to my controller. Okay, well now I have to go back, rebuild that whole jar file, and then redeploy it. Okay, all that just goes away. That's actually one of the funnest parts of the demo. And that was the part for me about developer productivity, right? It's going to have that happen really fast. So that's the end of my slides. I'm going to do the demo and the Q&A. And if you guys have any questions or if you guys need help with anything, feel free to give me an email. So that's my email address up there, and I'm on SeaJUG and all that fun stuff too. So. Okay, enough of the slides. Okay.
So, Will, how long has this framework been around? You know the history behind it?
No, not a ton. I'd say less than a year. Yeah. No, maybe a year. It's a good question. I don't know exactly what the first.
Formulating some of the ideas of Grails, and like kind of like dynamic, development.
Yeah.
Into more the Java way.
Yeah. Who did what where first? I don't know.
Do you know how it compares to Woo, the Spring thing?
How it relates to Roo?
Yeah.
So I looked at Roo briefly. Roo does. So for those of you who don't know, Roo is another project from the same guys who did Spring, and it's a sort of a development implementation where it kind of sits there as this process running, and then you're able to edit things. And what it does is it does aspects under the covers. So Play does class library enhancement. So it's more like CGlib kind of stuff, like what Hibernate does, and not aspects like Roo does. Personally, I found this to be more straightforward and understandable than the Roo stuff, but I don't know. It's another framework, another tool.
So this is all Java stuff?
Yep.
It's not like Ruby, right?
Nope, it's all Java code.
It's all Java. Oh,
Yep.
So Roo is the same thing. It's just all Java.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting. So just as sort of a side note, so I spent about 2 years working with a team on a Groovy and Grails project, and we even did a presentation for. I think Gabe and I did a presentation for SeaJUG about a year and a half ago. I think.
Yeah, last year.
Yeah.
Last year, December.
Yeah, and that was on Groovy and Grails. And I think personally, I was very torn about it because I thought, I guess the most brutal thing is that I felt like with the Groovy programming language, I was taking huge suites of kinds of errors and moving them from compile time errors to runtime errors, which for me was not a feature. So I think that was one thing that was challenging, and then the other one is that there were so many syntactical and stylistic differences between how you'd write good Groovy stuff and good Java stuff, that the code that you'd get by the time you're done, it was very difficult for people to just pick up and read unless they were really familiar with both environments. So I think those were the biggest challenges I had. I don't personally. I guess to put it another way, I found a Groovy check style. It's an automated code review. And there's either people who think that's a great idea or terrifying, right? And I guess part of it is that just how far can you scale it is the question. Right? Okay, so what I've done here is I downloaded the Play framework, and then the only installation I did was just adding the Play commands to my path. Okay. So let's see. So I'm going to go ahead, actually. So let's see. So I'm going to create a new app. Okay. So let's go ahead and run it. Actually, let's look at what I've got here first. I have an app, some configuration, the library is public, which is a set of static assets, and some test code. So let's cd into the app. And look at what I've got here. Controllers, models, and a view. Okay, so not a ton of stuff then right here. So let's go ahead and fire this up.
The Jetty.
No. So the question was, is this Jetty? And it's not. They're actually using, I think it's Mina or Grizzly. It's actually one of the much more lower level HTTP stacks, because you'll notice how quickly that launched, right? So let's go ahead and hit. So you guys may be wondering, I have my iPad and my MacBook here, so why am I demoing this thing in Windows? So all the Play stuff defaults to port 9000, and for some reason on my Mac I've got a service running on port 9000, and I don't want you guys to have to watch me change ports every time. So I fired it up, and by default Play loads in the sort of welcome page. But what's interesting to me here is the test runner. So because I'm running this in test mode, it added in this test suite view. So I can see my functional tests, my unit test, my functional test, and my Selenium test. So let's just go ahead and run.
That's interesting. So it's running the tests from within the application itself.
Well, it's running it, yeah, within the same context. But what's really interesting to me, and it was actually kind of a rude surprise when I first discovered it, is the test suite doesn't run in the same class path, though, right? So
runs everything under a different password and everything.
yeah, so it's a different. So at first I was like, oh, cool, I'm running in the same thing. I can go fiddle in the internal bits of the app for some of my setup and stuff. And it's like, no, you can't actually do that. Okay. So that's kind of cool. Now, I will confess that the guys who wrote the Play framework, they actually do all their demos straight out of a text editor. But I'm kind of lazy. I use Eclipse, so mostly because of autocomplete. But hey,
So is there an Eclipse plugin then?
play Eclipseify. Okay, so that's it. So let's go ahead and fire up Eclipse.
What about any support for like NetBeans or Radia or whatever?
So it's got NetBeans, Eclipse, IntelliJ, TextMate, and so TextMate is actually the one that a lot of the guys who work on it use, because it's kind of like just a really simple text editor that just does some auto completion. But I just like having the full suite of Eclipse, refactoring and everything. So let's go ahead and bring in the project. So here's this project I just created. So let's see what we got here. So I'm assuming you guys can see that basically okay back there. So here's my application. Here are my views, and here's my tests. So let's see. What's interesting here? Let's bring it up. So that's not terribly exciting. That's the controller. Right. Let's go ahead and look at the view that maps to that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this welcome, because that's the thing that put that huge chunk from the docs. Now let's just do, because that's the law. You have to always do that. It didn't work. Actually, have to start the server. So there's my hello world. Okay, so now let's say, so this is HTML. This is actually using Groovy for the programming language for the web pages, interestingly enough. So here's my controller, and let's go ahead and okay. I'm going to switch back over here. So what did I just do there?
There was some sort of an implicit map or something like that that you put the data in to serve the view.
Yeah, so basically here this particular line of code is my controller, right? And I just added in a new object, right? A hello object with world stuffed in as the value, and there's the hello down there. And then when I viewed the page, I was able to see the hello, the world from up here. Now what's different between that and say regular Spring MVC development? For that edit, compile, debug cycle, right? I was editing the Java code up here directly, and I just hit refresh on the browser, and bam, I saw the changes that I was making to my controller, right? So what Play actually does under the covers is it keeps track of all the classes, and it actually does the compilation for you with the refresh, looking after the timestamps. So think about it like this. So what's cool about JSP, right? How does JSP work? It takes your JSP file, it converts that to a .java file, it compiles the .java file into a .class file, and then it loads that class file, right? And then if I make more changes to the JSP, it repeats that whole process for you.
But that's the fast one. You already said that that's the feedback you get as a developer. Save the JSP and you can see it.
Exactly.
It's not usually a problem.
Right.
It's all those other classes that happen to be hooked in somewhere and in a cache.
Right. It's all the rest of your Java code. It's the controllers, the models, all that kind of stuff, right? So this is kind of where what gets to this kind of this philosophical question that I threw out in the topic notes, which is what is a dynamic language? What makes it dynamic, right? So does this framework make Java a dynamic language? Let's see how far we can go with this. Let's see. Actually, let's try something for a minute. It's actually one of my little issues. So the first time I sat down with JSF, right? Cool framework. You know, I went to Java 1 that year, and they gave everybody a free copy of the creator tool. And took it home. I was very excited. Well, so I started working with the tool, and then I made a typo on the pages, right? And what happened? It all just stopped working. It completely hosed. No error line numbers, no this is what you kind of did wrong, nothing, just dead, dumb, doornail. So that kind of put me off on trying to do JSF because it was, it's as much work trying to solve the problems as it is, right? So with Play, it puts all the feedback directly into it, and you'll note that it gives you pretty nice feedback to tell you exactly what's going wrong, what line, what happened where.
Does it compile that when you make the request?
Yeah.
Or are you doing it in the...
It does it when a request comes in, then it does the recompile. Now, just as a side note, so jumping ahead, just like you can actually do with JSP, I don't know if you guys have ever done this with Tomcat or not, there's a pre-compiler for JSPs. So when you go to production, you typically don't want to have to wait for all these JSPs to compile, and if you're in a very painful situation, then you write like a little script that like touches every one of the JSPs for you or something like that. Well, you don't really want to do that. You actually want to run a JSP pre-compiler, and it'll pre-compile the JSPs for you, so then you have to wait for it to run through all that. Play supports the exact same thing. When you want to go to production, then you can tell it to pre-compile, and it does all of the pre-processing for you.
when it's doing this incremental compiling, how is it keeping track of dependencies?
You know, that's a really good question. I honestly haven't gone into that level of depth on it. I know that I've never had any problems with it. You know, I've been working
The
with
job act keeps track of exactly what classes need to be done. So-
Yeah, I don't know. Does Java C?
Well, yeah, but if you're using, if you're running a test and all of a sudden you realize, oh shoot, I'm using the wrong version of this SQL library, and you just copy the new lib in, does it pick it up, or do you have to restart the server?
If I do what now?
If you want to,
You're just trying to break it.
If you want to go from MySQL, 1.1 to MySQL 1.2,
Right.
jar,
Right.
and you just go to Eclipse and you copy the jar in,
Oh, what is it going to do? Yeah, it won't pick up the new jars for you
so you have to start. You still have to do the start-stop to
for a
to
new
get-
jar file.
Eclipse does it not. And I'm not quite sure, I don't know enough about code to say that, but Eclipse does a lot of that stuff for you, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, but Eclipse is doing it. Every time in Eclipse you hit compile, it's a whole new JVM start off that moment.
it's already
With
done.
this, with this, you have a JVM in the background continuously running.
No, well,
So
what I'm saying is
You
the
can't
following.
just do jar loading.
What I'm saying is the following, that when you are in a Eclipse and your Tomcat is looking at the exploded bar file, it's just a simple folder. And as you're doing your stuff, Eclipse does a compile and generates your JSP stuff, like you said, it generates your class files, and the Tomcat picks it up. That is a default behavior for Eclipse.
You can actually, I mean, this is not new.
Yeah. So
You can
so
do it with.
So Tomcat's kind of a different thing, and like the hot redeploy, like even on
It's the
JSP,
Right, exactly.
you can turn that off and on.
Eclipse does a compile for you,
Yeah.
and you're okay.
So with Play, all I can say is I've been doing it for 6 months now, and I've never had to or cared really about swapping out a library underneath it. I've dropped in new ones, but and some of that's even OS dependent. Like on Windows, my library is usually locked by the VM anyway. The libraries are, so I can't pop it in and out. So I got a lot of questions on this one. All right, I'll take one or two more depending on how time.
All HTML is that HTML. Do you get to start talking about file includes and CSSs and things? Or, I mean, it
Yeah.
claims to be HTML, but you're not very HTML there. You don't have a body tag and an HTML tag.
No, this particular, so it's groovy, so it's and this is, that's the syntax. So this is extending the main and setting the title to home, and then it's just got the HTML. This is the template that it comes with, but you can throw all this out and start to do your own thing if you'd rather. So it's just getting the title that it picked up from the subpage, setting the character set, adding in a style sheet. You note that it's got a special syntax for looking up the resources, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. And then it's also got the do layout. So the do layout's picking up the template. So it's just the default templating that it comes with. Okay.
Will.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
That was the other question.
So how does it handle, because Tomcat sort of has fallen over as soon as you get to a singleton.
Sorry, what was that?
Tomcat's hot reload seems to fall over, or at least it did when you hit a singleton.
So so the question was, is Tomcat falls over with a singleton?
How does this guy?
How does this handle it? So far, I've been using factories and things, and it just works. It just picks up everything. So
And not only singleton, but pretty much static variables.
Right.
yeah.
And everything's static. You need to restart because it's got it in the VM. The VM's just holding onto it. It's appropriated cache.
Well,
Namespace.
to elucidate on the point the gentleman made here about Eclipse, though, OSGI creates like separate pass loaders and all that stuff for all your plugins and stuff like that. So, the language has support for doing all that stuff. In terms of like handling factory singletons and all that stuff also. It's just a question of the implementation, whether it actually does it or not. Sounds like it does. Well, Will claims it does. So.
All right. Well, let's see what happens. So here I just added a singleton or a static variable.
Okay.
And put in and working.
Okay, got it static. Now the question is, you gotta change it out from under it somehow.
Yes.
How would you like me to change it out?
Yeah, that's
Just set it to,
Remove
no,
these.
Just set it to
Initialize it to
Set it
one.
to 1.
Yeah.
Okay.
2 1 bases.
Sure.
2 bit 0 based. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh.
I think that's a good test.
Well, but you don't know whether.
They're like, I was trying to break it, but I'm not sure what that meant.
Well, it just means, that you started the virtual machine over, right?
Well, yeah, it's
Or yanked
reading
the class
some of the
loader or
classes.
whatever it did.
Which is probably good, I guess.
Exactly.
Or it actually might be spinning up new contexts. And-
That's
and
what
they're-
Comcast trying to do.
and accumulating them. But, in a dev environment, that's okay.
Right. What Comcast trying to do is start a new home chain.
So remember, this is not running Tomcat,
Right.
right? It's running its own server instance, and it's able to do its own
Right.
class loading and tracking stuff. Which right out of the gate, I think, is part of the issue. Is that these guys keep it really tight and lean what they're hanging on to and what they're flushing. With Tomcat, you have this huge stack of stuff that you're hanging on to and having to recycle. So exactly what's going on where, I don't know. So let's go ahead and, so we just added our little static views, but what's more interesting is the database, right? So let's try that. So I'm going to do new model. So Play does come with a little Eclipse plugin, which I'm only going to use because, well, I'm a little lazy that way. So let's actually go into the models here. And let's call this okay, so what do we notice about this? So I do have to do a couple of imports. Now this is one of the things that right out of the gate, right, some people go cool and some people don't like, which is that it assumes some importing in some play stuff. So if you're now it's only going to pull in JPA. All model is a map superclass with the ID and the generated value. So all it is doing JPA for you, but it is pulling in a little bit of stuff. That's what the model extends is. Okay, now let's go ahead and add something to this. Okay, and let's see now. So one of the things that's interesting here is, what am I not typing in? I'm done with my model. Accessors and mutators. So basically our getters and setters, right? So this is actually part of the confessional part of our presentation. So you saw at the very beginning when I did my slides that one of the places I was working was Symantec, right? And at the time we made this cool tool that let you use drag and drop to build little GUIs in AWT, right? Yeah, exactly.
Use that tool.
Yeah, use that tool because
I remember
everyone knows
editing
that
this
applets are the
code.
future, right? Applets are going to rule everything. So that's where that getter and setter stuff came from, was from this Java Bean specification. And so part of the point of the getters and the setters was that you weren't really in the Java Bean spec supposed to have one getter affect, or one setter affect another value, right? But if you wanted that to happen, you wanted to have in this ability to be able to propagate changes, so that way the GUI tool would look nice, right? So, like for example, let's say I had a getter and setter for age and a getter and setter for birth date. Well, those two things might affect each other. So you wanted to have this ability to be able to do something called property
Change
event,
listeners and all that.
property change notifications and all that kind of stuff. Now, what was cool about Java Beans was that you'd write this little class, and if you just wrote getters and setters on it, and then you dropped it into a tool like Visual Cafe, it would pick up all those getters and setters for you and put that right into the little palette, and you'd look like you'd written a real honest-to-God component, and it was really cool. So when Hibernate came along, right, everybody was writing these little pojos for their GUIs apps. And so the Hibernate guys said, well, let's use the same design pattern. We'll use these getters and setters, just like they use for the other stuff. And it, the height of insanity on it, of course, came to right? Being able to go right into Eclipse and source, I think it's source, generate getters and setters, right? So nowadays, of course, for years now, I've been working on projects where all people do is they write this, right? And then they go into Eclipse and they generate all the getters and setters. Okay? Why? What's the point?
Something outside expects it to look that way. So
Because something needs it.
Well, but isn't the principle to make all your variables private so that you can change the structures of the variables and the interface stays the same for all of these associated.
Right, but as Ward Cunningham has said, what's the point if your IDE can encapsulate a variable for you when you need to make the change?
Right. So part of it is this premise of something called an anemic, and it's actually the more underlying concept is what they call an anemic object model, right? Where it's this object model, but there's nothing actually in it, right? Like most of the time, what most people are doing with stuff like Hibernate is they're taking a data, usually it's a table, and then they're copying all the values out, sticking them into these object, and then passing it around. What's even worse is then if you actually did anything with the getters or setters, okay, now you're just suddenly breaking everything, right? Because it assumes that there's symmetry between the getter and the setter. So if the getter and the setter don't have symmetry, well, now you've just confused all these apps that are depending on that symmetry. So like Hibernate, try writing complex getter and setter stuff and seeing how well that plays with the persistent stuff. Okay, well, now all of a sudden you're into the bowels of dealing with how does Hibernate actually deal with getters and setters and when it throws values in and when it doesn't in proxy objects and stuff.
So this is going to be bringing properties as in C# to Java by doing aspect-oriented coding. Is that what it's going to do?
Right. So basically, to cut to the end of the story, as it were, for that, we're kind of jumping to the end of the fairy tale on it. What it does is it actually does do some class file enhancement to drop the getters and the setters in underneath the covers. But what's interesting is all the field access even still works sort of independently of that. So the code that you write throughout the rest of it, like when I'm in Eclipse and everything else, I'm going to actually put in product.title, not product.getTitle. So, little known feature in Hibernate is that you actually can have Hibernate operate that same way.
Yeah, there's a switch somewhere.
Yeah, and you can flip it off. And so this is kind of where that confessional part comes in, because I feel like there are these millions and millions of lines of utterly pointless code that are in every Java project for all these getters and setters. And so some people, it's like, oh, we need something like the property thing from .NET, right? Or we need whatever to clean it up. I don't really care what the answer is, frankly, at this point. I just wish people could get away from it. Either flip the little switch in Hibernate or whatever. So yeah.
For entities, you would go for a bunch of public, you're going back to a C struct, and just say, look, just lay them out there.
You know, damn near. I don't know, and that's where, like, what's interesting here is that, and we'll come back, because I'll use this anemic model for describing some of this, but then the way that Play typically does is then they go ahead and put in some of their access, sort of their DOA kind of methods, like all their finders and stuff. They put those in, throw those in this class anyways.
So isn't that the Groovy approach as well? In Groovy,
yeah.
You don't provide accessors and
Absolutely.
figures them out.
Yeah, but I don't have to learn a new language and all that other stuff. I'm just writing Java code.
Actually, that's fairly common in most dynamic languages. Python does it that way too. So it's kind of a...
Well, pretty much everybody agrees that it's stupid, right, in the getters and setters at this point. There's a few people that somewhere out there that might make a case for it sometimes in special certain cases. And in point of fact, just like actually in Groovy, if I write a getter, I could override if I want to put a getter or a setter in here and override, then it won't generate one to override it. So I can do my magic thing if I really wanted to.
So, sort of like doing the properties in C#.
Was that? Yeah.
Sort of like doing properties in C#. You can provide them if you really want to.
Yep.
Or Objective. Somebody else back here says or Objective-C does the same kind of thing.
Yep. Okay, so
C# got it, right? No, that would be wrong.
So let's see now.
I'm glad.
Well, this is an interesting one. So I'm gonna cheat here.
Where'd you get all those methods? They ready?
You need a variable name.
Oh,
Yeah,
duh.
you need a,
Thanks, guys.
It happens.
I know. All right, not using it. Okay. So first of all, this one cracks me up. It's this wacky syntax, which I found which is in the play docs. It's actually part of the Java spec, which is handling some of that casting back. So I'm getting a product back, but I want to cast it back to the specific product collection type. So that's the syntax for doing it, which is actually just part of the Java spec, which I didn't even realize until I started working with Play. And it looks kind of hideous, but kind of everything with collections does in Java, but that's the way that works if you want to do that.
Well, where did that method is on product, and we are looking at product, it doesn't have any such static method.
Right.
Oh, and the get all, woo, there it is. It's in there, okay, so it's in there. It doesn't magically come all of a sudden because some weird path
No.
from the job act and then aspect
No.
oriented. It's
Like
really
any
good in
other
there.
oriented programming library.
Yeah, and that's part of where like I like Play is that I get all my autocomplete. So with Groovy, when you work with Groovy, because everything's so dynamic and everything's a duck and whatever, you don't get a lot of the autocomplete working properly or the way that you expect or want it to. So either you have to wait for the IDEs to get a lot smarter, which frankly none of the plugins, in my opinion, were of the point where they were really working. Or you just wind up having to guess and pray a lot. And so with Play, I get all the autocomplete. So remember when I said that I was lazy because I use Eclipse? Because I do use autocomplete. So let's go. Okay. So now I'm adding in products as well.
Oh, you sure you spelled that right? Because your list was called products and your variable was
No.
called product. You're going to get yourself confused there eventually. Sorry. I would.
Ta-da. Okay. This is not my production ready code. All right, so products. So now for this, let's see. So I'm going to crib off of my notes here.
This is looking a lot like free marker.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
Yeah.
say. Too. It's velocity or free marker. And the way that you put in things into a map to render, it's just like velocity or free marker. The controller, yeah.
Or webpack code is the same thing.
Maybe that's what it is.
I think all of those letting it
How many products there?
Okay, so there's no product showing right now because I don't have anything in there, right? So the next thing we need to do is add in a form that will let us do some products. So let's go ahead and do this.
This is the HTML. It becomes that.
Well, it is.
That JSP.
It's
It's a
fragments of HTML.
Oh, it's their JSP.
This is the language JSP.
Their template. Right, template.
Actually, what's interesting is this will work even if I don't put that in. Okay. So what's kind of interesting about this is I'm making a reference here to this form just with this add, right? So now let's go ahead and put in the add method. So I'm just going to hang this right off of the same application controller. Okay. So you guys see what I just did there? So I just put in the object and then put in a straight save on it and then said give me the index again. So you guys follow that? I want to walk you through that.
What's that?
So the form add. Now let's actually look. Actually, let's.
So the list is drawn.
So let's look at the source here for this. So now I just put in the method add here, but it automatically created this. The form action is mapped for me automatically, right? Method post, accept character set, UTF-8, all that, and then the input name, and that's that. So it turns out that just hitting return counts as a form submit in most of the browsers, so that's why I didn't even have to put in the submit. But you'll note it automatically bound all that, the URL for me.
So that's actually mapping into the application controller and the add method in there?
Yeah, so let's look at the routing for a minute. So I mentioned that I like the routing system in this quite a bit. So
You could put in some kind of proxy or something to keep out parsing the data when it comes in, make sure you're not doing SQL injection or something like that.
so validation is something that we'll talk about that in just a sec. So okay, so I have my home page and I have a static directory. So the static directory, anything I drop in there, it's just going to get treated like an out-of-the-box raw reference. So if I want to drop in images and JavaScripts and stuff like that, then I put that in the public. And then I have this catch-all with the controller/action. And it automatically maps that to the controller.action. So let's give this a try here. So let's just make this. So the parser on this little thing, this actually came from the Play guys. The parser on this router thing is kind of broken, to be honest. So now I just did okay. Let's look at this again. So let's make sure it works. Now let's look at this. Check that out. Can you guys see that?
It's going to sample.add. Now, why did it?
So why is it doing that? What the heck just happened there?
Because when it wanted to generate a post, it looked in this little routing thing and said, well, that's we're going to go to sample.add.
So in my page, let's see. It routes and page. Okay, so here's what's going on, and I know that this is like, and especially from like if you're really concerned about URLs and how all this stuff is bound. So what I did here was I said in the form, this is saying I want to have this form point to the add method, right? And it's implicitly this form, because I came to this form from the application controller, it knows that that's the controller I'm already on, okay? So the router, this, right, it's going to generate HTML that corresponds to that controller, but what it does is it actually looks up the first match for application add for a URL path.
It actually goes right to left.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's right to left, yeah. Does that make sense?
Function instead of
So from a URL management standpoint, it's really slick, because that means I can go ahead and I can define my URL structure independently from my code. So let's say that the marketing department came to me tomorrow and they said, okay, all of these places where you say sample/add, okay, that really should have been, I don't know, go fish/add, right? So now you need to go back in your application, you need to change every link that points from that one to the other one, right? So now that's a one-liner change.
So that first get is what told you to go to application controller in the first place? When you just went to the local host?
So when I first come into the page, right, So I come into index, right? And so what happens is index. So when I go back to, let's see, let's look at my web browser. So here I am, I'm on localhost 9000, so it's just the port, right? I'm just going to the root page, right? So when the request first comes in, it says get the root here, right? Which is then defined as application.index, which is this, right? So then,
And since now it's under application,
now it's under application.
everything
So,
else is.
yeah, so it drops in a couple of objects, right? So this one came from the database, those others, one's from our fun little static thing that we added, one's just a thing, and then it drops it into render. So for render, by default, it just looks for something application index, same name, and drops me into this page here, which is what we were just playing with. So that it lists all the stuff that we asked for, and then it says form, add, and then it's got the method name.
So
Now, if I wanted to,
HTML located in the right path that corresponds to the static method in a package.
right, so it's saying use application index from application index from the controller. So that's the same kind of
All application
convention.
index, use it in page application index using a slightly different path. Look up the, put it all together, put it on the page.
Yep. And what's kind of cool is, so I'm able to very simply and organically do the chaining here, right? So for the add page, I do the product save, and then I just bounce people back to the index, and then it does the rendering again.
What about debugging? What's the debugging experience?
What about debugging? That's a good question.
Break one.
What was it? Well, okay, so there's two answers for debugging. There is my personal ghetto favorite. Okay, so you guys can boo me all you want. But what's kind of cool about play, of course, right, is that because it's dynamic, I can throw one in, do my thing, and then delete it, and it's cool, right? I said it was ghetto. I make no apologies.
Actually, it's not so ghetto because there was this thread on the mailing list about somebody who wanted to look at all references of like Iterator or something like that, one of the base collections or instances in the collections API, and so that's kind of the case where you literally have to write some code to do the debugging because the debuggers don't support that level of,
Until today.
Well,
some
I
some of them
believe
don't.
the suggestion was to use log4j,
Yeah,
not
that
to
would
use
be-
system out print log.
Yeah, that would be what I would be.
Oh, yes, well.
but case in point though, this doesn't
Okay.
do that.
Okay, so technically, there's a built-in logger in play. Right. Whatever. So I could do that, and obviously, if I intended for my system.out to stick around, I would have done the logging that way.
You can put a breakpoint, I assume, and stop.
Right. So I just added a breakpoint here, and then what I do is I go into the debugger, and I do go into the debug config, and it actually does let me attach. Oh no, it's not that way. I didn't pick that up.
You're not running it already, are you?
Not running it.
No.
It's right already.
So you go into debug config, and then
Isn't it remote Java application?
there we go. So now I've attached the debugger. I set a breakpoint here. Swing back over here. What did I attach?
No, you went to configuration.
Oh yeah, you did configure, you did actually do it.
Connection refused. No, it should 8,000. Because I'm in debug mode.
Test by default. See if you can tell it, Jeff.
Oh, telnet to port 8000.
Okay, right there at the top. See, it's listening to
Yeah, it's listening. That's actually kind of weird. I do that all the time.
Make sure the host name's like localhost, sure.
Localhost 8000. Standard attach.
Your port is correct, I guess.
Yeah, it looks like it.
What's the DDO?
Huh. Weird.
Maybe that other clicking you did, try to attach it to, and or you get like.
Is there server listening on that port too?
It's
Stop. Just say switch to the debug or something.
So maybe these are some of the side effects of the class loader flakiness.
No, I do this all the time. It's usually fine. So there we go, I'm running.
It's better.
Switch back over real quick. There we go. Bingo. Ta-da. There you go.
Step over products.
So yeah, I mean the only thing that gets confused obviously is so the debugger actually has in it in Eclipse some notion of being able to like swap in and out code, and then obviously Play can change out everything underneath the debugger on you. So you don't want to be doing the Play like live edit while you're attached to the debugger. I mean you can if you want, and worst case I guess you just crash Eclipse or something. But anyway, so there you go.
What do you mean? I debug on web apps all the time that have breakpoints in server-side code. You're saying you can't do that?
No, I mean I've got a breakpoint and all that. What I'm saying is that Play, right? It lets you swap code in and out underneath the covers on you, right? So JDPA, it might get confused with that. I'm just saying if you want to try it, go for it. But if you you may or may not want to.
What database are you using?
So by default, it just uses HSQLDB.
And did you set up the structure before that, or like, I mean, how did that?
Yeah, so let's
happen?
go ahead and we're now running. Breakpoints, switch back over. Okay, so your question again was around how it's configured and set up. Okay, so this is the Play configuration file. So you see a name, dev, set to prod, and it behaves differently, of course. This is the cryptographic for signing the user ID and the cookie that gets sent out, I mentioned before. And then you can add in additional modules. So what we've been looking at so far is just out-of-the-box Play, where it just assumes that I'm talking to a database, and a piece of JPA, and that's pretty much it. But if I wanted to go through the modules, I will bring up the modules list in just a minute, and you can see all the different things I can drop in. Like obviously if I want to add support for Google App Engine or Stack or something like that. It's got localization, the server ports, all this good stuff, logging levels. So all this stuff's in here by default, and it's got a nice set of, if I want to connect to a MySQL database, things commented out, connection pool config, all that good stuff. Memcached, so if I want to use that, drop that in. It's got a mock SMTP, I can put in the real one. It has a job engine in it as well. Okay. So let's see, you saw how that stuff works. Okay, so validation. Who's asking about validation? Okay. So right now I can do this. kind of ugly, right? So what's going on there? It's empty, right? So let's add in required and okay. It's still working.
Will,
Yeah.
why are those methods static?
You know, that's a good question. It's just the design that they use for it. I think that the theory, if you go up on the Play Framework site, they talk a lot about trying to keep the methods kind of in with the intent behind like the HTML spec. And so the idea there is that, you know, these are static methods servicing, you know, incoming requests.
Right, but it seems strange that you're extending controller, but obviously if it's static methods, they're not actually using controller as an interface. It looks like it's just extending it for the purposes of giving you handy access to the methods.
Yeah.
But that means all the
Which one's
methods
static?
themselves are all static.
Yep.
But they're protected.
Yeah.
It's
It doesn't
framework.
make sense to me because it seems like multiple people are going to use it at the same time. So, and each person doesn't necessarily want to share that method.
Right. So the theory, of course, here, right, is them not sharing stuff between these static methods. Each one's on its own
Don't store
separate
anything in
thread.
a static variable hidden inside that class. Then you share.
Exactly. So if you got some stuff coming in, you know, your product or account object stuff, you can use that there.
So it's actually
Persistence that's providing it in your atomic transactions.
right. So it's actually even more interesting than that because let's look at this that I just did here. So this validation thing, right? It's binding these validation errors. So what I'm shooting for here, and this is a little bit on the cuff, and I'm going to tweak this method a little bit to make it do what I want in a minute. But so the product that is coming in, it's coming in from that form, right? And then I'm calling this validation has errors method, right? So the question then, of course, is, well, wait, where's that data coming from, and how's it binding to that, right?
Yeah,
So
where
the
did
short
product get delivered to the validation object such that it would decide if it had errors or not?
Probably use thread local to
Exactly.
store it.
So it's using thread locals to hang on to all that stuff underneath the covers, and that's actually part of how I believe it's also simplifying some of this class management stuff, is because it's just like chucking the thread and starting over on that stuff.
Well, and of course, if you manage to kill the thread, then it cleans up after itself automatically. Right.
So keep in mind that this is a servlet, which is being shared by many threads, right?
Only the
So-
dispatcher, not this. This class gets loaded by the server.
So is this thread safe? Because if
Yes.
usually action classes, let's say in the Stateless framework, for each request a new action class is instantiated. But here, if those methods are static, that means that they're all shared for all the requests. So
So the question is,
Are you required to-
the question is this stuff
synchronize
thread
it?
safe, right? So the short answer is that it's thread safe, but you're not sharing data between method invocations anyways, right? So to kind of go back to think about it for a minute, each static method is coming in with its own set on the stack frame, right? So it's not sharing any of these references or any of these objects between stack frames. So as long as you're not doing like this, right? Then you're cool. Like if I started throwing in, if I did this, if I wanted to break this, you know, I could. Well, this is part of where it's forcing you. So if I said, oh, well, I want to do
That's why
product.
you have static methods. So
Right.
kind of
Product.
make you aware that hey, this is being shared.
Right. In the VM.
Yeah.
Here it is.
So if I said if I wrote something like that, well, that's cool. But then if I went down here,
You're not going to be able to do it in the static method. It has to be static.
yeah. So if I go down here and I do ASDF, I can't do it.
Gotta be
So
static.
So basically, in the VM, all of those static methods are going to be running in a separate stack.
Right. So
Method stack.
yeah. So each static method has got its own stack chain. So that's where the products, like the product is going to be different on each one because that's coming in differently on each static. But and then it keeps all the things that look like they're being shared, like the validation and stuff like that. Those are all done with thread locals as well to bind it to that specific thing. So that's how the render arguments work up here as well. Same basic deal. In the back.
You typed two magical things: validation and at required. What does at required make the framework do, and what did and how did it get to validation, or if any, if there's a connection? I don't even know.
Yeah, absolutely. So the at required is an annotation that's just being applied. It's just a regular Java annotation.
Sure.
And it's just a validation marker that I'm putting on this.
That says
I need this product object to be on the incoming values. So I'm going to make it a little bit more simple and a little bit more straightforward.
no, I wanted to fill in an entire object. That's not what I would do.
Oh, it only has a string right now.
Yeah, because I could bounce back into the product object and then put the annotation there as well, which may be actually what we prefer. All right, let's try it. Let's do it.
How is your framework going to know that suddenly it has to pass back a string rather than a product?
What's that?
How did your framework generate the product, and how did it know when you switched the code that it now needed to pass a string, not a product?
So how did it know that I created a product?
Because product has a constructor that takes a string.
Yeah. So if you look at the HTML source for this, it's got product.title. And so what the framework does underneath the covers is actually does the binding to the ID, and then it generates a new object, and then it binds those values back over and spits it back out. It's pretty crazy stuff, actually.
So
Do you want to push it a little bit more? So let's go ahead and do this.
There we go.
And
Will, why does that function out so you can't have two of the same?
sorry, what was that?
Why is index at the bottom of add?
Why is index what?
Why was the call the index at the bottom of add? Is add supposed to?
Oh, so why was this called calling
submit
index?
doesn't automatically call index?
No, so the add method, what I'm doing here is I'm saying do all of this and then bounce up to the index method to do the
It's like
display.
an internal redirect, basically.
Yeah.
Put everything back in the.
Right, but on the page submit, wouldn't it call index automatically anyways?
Well, no, because so the form gets submitted to the ad, which then that controller picks it up. Then the controller then sends the redirect back to bounce you back to the
You have to
index.
explicitly specify it then, I guess. It doesn't automatically just.
So there isn't like an Uber controller that says that every page submit is automatically going to get rendered.
No, no, it's not like JSF or something like that, or one of those other yeah, it's not like that.
It just takes you there, but from there you have to know where you want to go.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh yes, I see what you're
You
saying.
know what I'm saying?
Yes.
He just puts an action thing from the
And
JSON.
no magic
there.
yeah.
There's no magic there.
Very very good point. It's because you might be going to some other index.
He just knows how to kind of.
So you're going to demonstrate empty.
Yeah, so I don't have the empty quite right. I need to add the minimum length on if I want to do what I actually wanted to do here. Because technically, an empty string is. is a Hibernate validator. All right. Okay.
Throw in another field and see, let's use 2 fields in the product or something.
Yeah, put a price in, make it,
Put a price in. Okay.
make it not 0. Oh, sure.
No negative prices.
Okay. I have no idea if this is working.
Don't you still need
Okay.
to put bracelets?
So what you notice right there is just by tweaking that, I re-triggered the entity manager, which, because I made a change to my model, so that re-triggered the entity manager, which the entity manager is currently set to drop and reload the database whenever I make a change, which obviously is cool for demos, but probably not what you want to have happen for a lot of other scenarios. So you can tweak that behavior yourself. So for the demo, I'm just using HSQLDB. What I do for most of my stuff is I use MySQL, and then I'm binding it myself. So, okay. Okay, don't code like I do here. That's still working.
Right, I think if you leave out the price input field, it should get an error because you didn't input the price at all.
Yeah.
So like you added a field to your data model and you forgot to update your.
Oh wait.
Default is 0, so
Oh.
we'll put 0.1 in there.
No, it's still working. I didn't put that. I'm missing something on my validation. Fire product.
What does validation that keep do?
So, and that's why I was going to flip it to a string because I know it's a little easier for me to illustrate it. So what keep does is when I say the index here, it's actually a redirect. So normally it would wipe the validation from one request to the next, but I want to actually hang on to this validation because I want it to show up here. So anyway, long story short, it's got a validation stuff in it. So let's see now. We are unfortunately running a little short on time. I think you guys have seen the bulk of it. So the one thing I wanted to show you guys before I finished up with this was the Google App Engine stuff. So I didn't think I'd have internet connectivity, so I went ahead and sort of kind of Julia Childed this one a little bit and pre-baked it. So what I'm going to do is... What was that? Okay.
You said you're going to the cloud.
What's going to be? Oh, it's going to be in the cloud. It's a demo in the cloud. Okay. Okay. So this is a Google App Engine demo or sample app. And the big thing that you'll notice here is that I've dropped in another module. So when you go to the Play site, there's a whole list of all these modules that they have. And I've got a list of them right here. So this is actually some cool stuff. So I haven't looked at the app at all. This is actually kind of a crazy, slightly terrifying project, where what they're doing is they're building a web editor with fancy HTML5 stuff, where you can do all of your work with something like Play completely in the web browser. So personally, I'm terrified of that idea on some level because it really feels like we're getting a little too close to terminal stuff, but it's kind of an interesting project. Yeah, I haven't played with that because I'm not dealing with that kind of security stuff. Cobertura is code coverage, so you can see how much of your tests are exercising all this stuff. Database, extended CSS, which was replaced, Excel, so you can create Excel files. This is the Google App Engine stuff that I'm showing you right now. CSS minimizing. If you really want to use dependency injection, here's Boost, which is the Google sort of mini injection toolkit, but it does use the standard GWT, Ivy, right? So I talked about Maven before with dependency management. That's one of my favorite things about Maven, but Ivy gets you the same thing. But you can also use Maven. There's a database migration thing. So there's a lot of stuff in here. So OAuth, which is kind of a cool federated login thing. So what you do is you just simply type the name of the module that you want. You create your project, and then you type the name of the module, and it drops it in, which I can't show you because I don't have net access. This is one of the cloud providers. This lets you do routes through annotations. So you saw how I was showing that little text file, really simple. Well, with this, you can just drop them right off annotations. Lots of stuff for that. Scala. So they're adding in a Scala module, so you can do all of your work that way. That's what you're interested in. Search. You can use Spring if you want. Stacks, VM. So these are all the modules.
So it was doing some magical stuff where it made entity objects and added them to your database, but some of us start with databases that are fairly well behaved, modeled somewhere else in Hibernate. What would that look like?
Totally. So there's two choices there. So what I do personally is I use the MySQL modeler tool to model out my stuff first, generally. And then I usually wind up reverse engineering that in. I just use the JPA generator in Eclipse, and then it spits out JPA stuff for me, and then I can just crib it right over. So I can pretty much start with just my data model.
I mean, then now in your class path, and they're all marked so that it does the right things, or
yeah, no, I drop them. What I do is I take the JPA stuff that came in, and then I copy the source over. So I'm not like pre-building Hibernate jar file. Hibernate. I'm not pre-building my Java classes into a separate jar file and then bringing them into play. Which I don't know. I honestly haven't looked at it, so I don't know how that would work. I mean, you wouldn't.
Because I'm not going to sit there and invent my entire data graph, by typing in fields.
Oh yeah, of course. So all the libraries I've brought in have been fine. You can turn off the Hibernate part of Play if you want. So if you want to bring in Hibernate yourself, like if you've got an existing jar file that has all your JPA entities in it, and then you want to use that like with Spring and Hibernate and bring that in and just sort of use this as just a pure, web controller framework that sits on top of your existing stuff, you could totally do that.
Oh, but these are active entities. They're active.
But you wouldn't want to mix and match the two, most likely.
Wouldn't necessarily mix and match, but maybe if you felt like this would be quicker web development or something, just wondering,
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, it's a little bit like you can do it. I just don't know how much work it would be and what you'd get out of it at the end. Like I said, what I'm doing is I typically work off of a data model first, get that kind of tight like I want it to be really clean. Then I create my JPA from that, and then I usually go in and clean it up a little bit. I change some of the names to make the Java names nice, and there's a few annotations that that you don't get out of the box as nicely. Like I might want to redo how some of the many-to-many associations or some of the collections are set up, right?
So you spit that into a directory full of objects and now it'll do the rest of it about get alls and find bys.
Yep. So then I usually bring it in, and then what I've been doing on mine is I tweak it to tweak the inheritance to match what play expects, and then I'm off to the races. And I usually actually wind up deleting a bunch because I don't actually need all the getters and setters at that point. I just delete those because it's like they're dumb. But I got them for free when I did the JPA reverse engineering off the model. So.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
Question. Does it have scaffolding functionality?
One of the modules.
Yep, absolutely. So I don't have that for in my demo. Yeah. Well, so the question. So does it have scaffolding? Can I do something like Grails where I can get CRUD screen set apps? Yeah, it has a module that does it, and it comes out, I think, comparable to what you get from Grails if you just start out with nothing, and then you could just add in. So if you just want to add in purely scaffolded stuff, you just say, controller extends CRUD, and then you get it. And then the security stuff we didn't really get into either, but there's a bunch of security stuff as well for user authentication and roles and stuff like that. And so then you can add that in as well. So in the sample online, they walk through showing how to build out a little CRUD administrative panel and then adding in the security stuff. The security model is pretty straightforward. You basically override, 2 or 3 methods to give it how your app wants to deal with security. How do you handle username and password, and where's that information and that validation coming from? Is it coming from an LDAP? Is it coming from a database? And then also, how do you want to interpret role management as well? So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's actually, I think, easier than trying to deal with like the Spring security stuff, but it's not going to deal with some of the high-end enterprise, login stuff. So it has a ton of stuff built in that I didn't even get into, like CAPTCHA, built-in CAPTCHA support. There's an image management API. I was going to show you guys the Google demo.
Who's doing all this stuff?
So who's
who's maintaining it?
Who's the backer? So it's actually a French company that does all the maintenance on this stuff. So and I'm blanking on the name. It's like Zenixity or something like that. And there's over 1,000 people on the mailing list, and it's pretty active, and they're kicking out releases pretty often. So
I see that there's 1.03.
Yeah. Oh. Actually, well, it's funny. Yeah, it's like so they're based in France. So of course, like I'm trying to think up an excuse to have to go visit the guys who created it. Like, oh well, maybe if I'll tell my wife I'm going to write a book on this topic, and so I need to meet with the creators before I can get started.
Tell you their spokesman.
The developer list in French?
No, the developers, all the communications in English.
Really?
So, yeah.
From a French company?
Yeah.
Oh.
Hey.
Into a continuous integration environment where it'll compile and your error messages will come out in that?
Yep. You can put it in a CI environment, and what's cool about it is that all the Selenium stuff works, which I really like. So I think there's a way to disable it if you want to run on a headless CI. But yeah, if you want to test your web tests, not only is it CI friendly, but it's also got the Selenium stuff also happening. So. Okay, here we go. So this is the Google App Engine demo app. And so what's kind of interesting is, so it's saying log in with my Google account, so I'm running this on my local demo, and because I'm not really running in the Google App Engine environment, it bounces me over to this administrative simulation. So I can type in test@test.com. Yes, I'm an administrator. And then it bounces me back over to the app. So this is all happening with the Google App Engine stuff driving it. So it has built-in jQuery support, so let us take a moment and look at
What has built-in jQuery?
Play. It bundles jQuery, and that's got some niceties in the API for that. So now, a module is actually just another Play project. It's given a name and a sub project, and then it gets woven in when you load it. So it's pretty straightforward to build modules. So this is the demo app here. So this is the code for this app. It's pretty straightforward.
So it has more than one way to find the right signature of. Got these the save method that took 2 strings or something instead of taking an object.
Yep. Yeah. The object binding is just kind of like a cool fancy feature, and it works fine for a lot of stuff. But obviously, there's other things where you're gonna keep it kind of simple, right? So it's just it's just a nicety, basically. Wrong one. It's just in the wrong place. So it is 9 o'clock right now. So time to wind up, wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, if you're pretty much done.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is a pretty rich framework, and it does a lot of stuff. So I could spend more time, but I think we're basically good to go. You guys
Any
have
other last questions, I guess, before we wrap up?
One, two last.
Yeah, sure. What have been some of the pain points, if any, that you've experienced using this version?
What are the pain points? So, yeah, I think that the documentation is pretty good, but I think it could go better. There is not a book on it yet. I think the biggest sort of difficulty that I've had is getting really clear about what was going on in the test, like the test universe and the app universe, because I basically thought that it was all running in one happy mush and thought I could reuse stuff more easily, and that's not what's going on. So I think a little bit of the testing stuff was a little bit trickier just because it wasn't doing quite what I expected. There is a Play 1.1, which is coming out soon, which is adding in a ton of features. And it's actually kind of gotten to be a little bit of a joke for me because, like, every time I'm like, oh, I wish it did this, and then I'd go check the bug list, and it's like it's usually already implemented in Play 1.1, but they don't consider that to be ready for prime time yet. So my appetite for bleeding edge on that particular one, this project I'm working on isn't quite that high yet. So just kind of waiting for getting some of those things. Like one of the ones I had was you saw that validation object. So that didn't clear out. It when you're writing functional tests, it doesn't clear out the validation object for you automatically. And there wasn't a nice method on it. So it's like, oh, go mail this. Oh, it's in Play 1.1. Okay, great. It's not quite there yet. Other than that, I guess the one that I've been surprised at is how I haven't, like I'm used to just like constantly dragging in new libraries for everything. And with Play, it's like I'm not doing that. Like I literally, I don't think I've added a single third-party library yet to my app. It's got even stuff like, you know, in time date, you know, there's like this notion of like sense, you know, like I want to be able to say this happened 2 minutes ago, this happened 4 hours ago. There's that kind of display of like date time stuff. Well, that's built into the Flash. It's like it's right in the templating language, so I just say sense on the date object that comes back in 2 seconds. You know, so I just keep, you know, kind of being surprised at not having brought in more libraries. You know, that's a complaint really. It's more of a shock. I would say that normally I find, oh, I know the other one. The test runner that I showed you, you know, I'm starting to get to where it's like 50, 100, 200 test classes in that. And so it doesn't have like, I'd kind of like it if it had like a search thing to just let me run just the one test a little bit more conveniently. Yeah, because the UI for the test runner isn't built to support hundreds of tests. But that's about it.
Well, that brings up a good point. How ready is this for like full large, you know, application projects, you know, enterprise level kind of things?
Yeah, I mean personally, I would say I'm using it on something right now that's gonna. I think it's gonna be about 20 tables worth of stuff. So then you can kind of impute a certain level of complexity from that statement. And I think it's fine. I wouldn't at this point. I don't think I would want to use it like for a, you know, like for my last project, which was like a 150 table thing. But then the flip on that is that I'm also sort of getting to where there's a certain small is beautiful aspect to that, right? So I don't know that I would say building one app for dealing with that kind of a thing is the model I'd go for anyways, right? So like if I was building an administrative app that was of a certain size, I think it's fine. You know, because of the stateless stuff, I'm actually pretty comfortable with a smaller app scaling really well, like from a performance standpoint. You know, but like I said, I mean, you know, like this project, you know, we had thousands of unit tests that we were running on this thing all the time, and I haven't stressed out its CI capabilities to that level. You know, to know like, okay, well, what does the testing framework look like when I push it that far? So, you know.
Oh, I'm sure as it progresses in versions, all that support will probably eventually
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? I guess we'll call it done with that.